A little earlier, I talked to the very distinguished opinion poll sort of guru, John Curtice, and I asked him what impact the row between Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon and her predecessor Alex Salmond was having both on support for the SNP and support for Scottish independence.
Well, it's certainly true that support for both the SNP and for independence has fallen somewhat in recent weeks, but actually that fall probably predates, or at least the beginning of that fall predates the time when this subject began to move up the media agenda, which is really the last 2 or 3 weeks. So to that extent, at least the SNP are in a somewhat weaker position now than they were, but not necessarily because of this issue. But beyond that, one has to say that certainly the events of the last week have been ones which have been viewed by SNP supporters with a degree of concern amongst a minority of them, but not in a way that is clear so far has done much damage to Ms Sturgeon. So what do I mean by that? Well, around 20% of SNP supporters think that maybe there was some kind of malicious plot to try to undermine Mr Salmond's reputation. But most SNP voters aren't of that view. And then when people are asked, well, which of the two characters do you think you're more inclined to believe? Well, amongst SNP supporters at least, the answer to that question is very clearly Ms Sturgeon. So to that extent, at least, the interviews of the last 5 days, Mr Salmond on Friday, Ms Sturgeon today, have occurred against a backdrop where, as it were, the crucial constituency, SNP supporters, were more inclined to believe the First Minister than they were her predecessor. The crucial question now, then, of course, is what have they made in the last 5 days when this really has been top box office? For what it's worth, my judgment would be in the wake of today, not necessarily that Ms Sturgeon is going to appearance is going to result in a gain in support for the SNP or a gain in support for independence, but I suspect she probably has limited the damage. And to that extent, at least, probably the SNP will go into the election, certainly as favourites, but by no means guaranteed to get an overall majority.
I mean, when it comes to Nicola Sturgeon's performance, she did seem to me to look remarkably composed and for most of the time, had a mastery of her brief through a marathon session in Holyrood. But just capture for us how important her reputation is for the success of the SNP and indeed for the independence project.
One of the potential problems the SNP face is that if indeed Ms Sturgeon were to go at any point in the immediate future for whatever reason, it is not entirely clear that they have somebody with the capability and the charisma to fill her shoes. Whereas, it was long clear that if Mr Salmond were ever to go, as he eventually did in 2014, that Nicola Sturgeon could replace him. So to that extent, at least, they're very clearly dependent on her. It's also the case that the current levels of support for independence, or the level of support we've seen quite recently, one of the reasons for that has been the perception that Nicola Sturgeon has handled the pandemic more effectively than Boris Johnson. And as a result of that, some people seem to draw the conclusion that perhaps an independent Scotland will be able to handle the pandemic better. That, frankly, is all very, very much conditioned and conditional on Miss Sturgeon's own political skills and the way in which she has been able to deploy those during the pandemic to convince people, frankly, that she knew what she was doing, whereas perhaps some people have had some doubts at some points in time that they could say the same thing about Boris Johnson. So to that extent, at least, she's been front and centre of the government's handling of the pandemic. And it's very difficult to believe that people would be as enthusiastic about the SNP, let alone independence, if all of a sudden she were to disappear from the scene.
Now, the SNP seems to be making the vote in the forthcoming election a vote on whether people want a referendum. The Tories are pitching themselves as being the party that would stop a referendum. When it comes to it, do you think voters in Scotland will see the parliamentary election as essentially a one-issue election about a referendum?
Back in 2011, when the SNP last got an overall majority, they only got that because they convinced quite a lot of people who weren't necessarily in favour of independence that they were the best party to put in power, to keep in power at Holyrood. That's not now the position. the SNP vote and the yes vote are now almost synonymous with each other. And the truth is, at the moment, unless the events of the last 5 days have suddenly changed things, is that the election in Scotland at the beginning of May is in effect going to be a quasi-referendum on the issue of whether or not A, there should be a referendum, and B, how people would vote in that referendum.
Now, don't go away, because after the break, there'll be more from John Curtice. Actually, I'm going to be talking to him a bit about what I talked to Lisa and Andy about, which is the performance of Keir Starmer and the Labour Party. Now, let's go back to Professor John Curtice, the polling guru. I asked him how he assessed Labour's performance under Keir Starmer, whether there are any signs it was making enough gains to win a general election.
It does show you that there is a limit to the extent to which you can, as an opposition, hope to make significant progress simply by attacking a government on the grounds of competence. Because one of the problems with that is occasionally that government might prove to be competent, as most people think is the case with the vaccine. The challenges facing Labour are threefold. One is, what is the vision that this party is going to present to the broader public about what it stands for? Now, Sir Keir Starmer, to give him his due, has begun to go down that path, but I think there's still an awful lot needs to be added to it, and an awful lot more people need to understand it. The second is that he needs to persuade people that the Labour Party could run the economy more effectively than the Conservatives, and they are still a long way behind that. And the third, frankly, is at the end of the day, he's got to perhaps think once more about what he's going to do about Brexit. I mean, there have been plenty of opportunities for an opposition in the last 2 months to attack the government for the way in which Brexit has been working out. However, most of those chances have been passed up by the opposition, even though most of their electorate is a Remain electorate. Now, I understand the Labour Party wants to get the Red Wall voters back, but perhaps there's a lesson here, is that they also need to make sure they're criticising the government sufficiently to ensure that they keep their Remain voters on side.